Hi, Elaine here with another colouring video for Stamping Bella. This one is a little bit different, as you may have already noticed. I don't usually do voiceovers, but I thought it was about time I gave it a go again, since some of you have been requesting that. Today I've got a little scene that I stamped and masked using the Stamping Bella Irish Chicks stamp set along with the Love backdrop. This was inspired by our current Wonderful Wednesday guest on the Stamping Bella blog, Kelly Latavola. Kelly has been inspiring me recently to get out of my stamping rut and start creating some fun scenes again. So when she did her Irish Chicks card last week, I was inspired to go and create one of my own with my own little twist. So this is my... As you can see, I've masked together the 3 chicks and the cloud with the rainbow and the Love backdrop stamp. And at the moment I'm colouring the sky. Quite often recently I've opted to use distress inks or distress oxides to colour the sky. On this card I wanted to keep it purely Copic marker, so I went for a simple technique, which is basically just using blue Copic markers and a kind of scribbly technique to fill in the area. I'm not doing anything particularly special here, just working fairly quickly and keeping the edges wet and trying not to create any lines. So I'm using kind of a scribbly technique and keeping the edges sort of messy so that it all kind of blends and you get a slightly textured effect, but no really harsh lines. A couple of notes. I have sped up the colouring process in this video because otherwise it would be incredibly long and I'd rather you spent your time colouring than watching me colour for hours on end. So no, I don't colour quite this fast. I think the entire colouring process took me about an hour and a half, which tends to be the case with kind of scenes and more detailed stamps. You should be able to see that up in the top corner I am listing the Copic markers that I'm using as I'm using them. Once I've filled in the whole sky here, I then come back in with a darker shade of blue, coming down from the top, trying to get a nice graduation of colour, just to give a little bit more depth to it. It's a little hard to see on the video, it was a bit more obvious in person. When I finished sort of adding this layer of colour and then blended it out with the lighter shade again, I wasn't entirely happy with the transition between the two colours. However, sometimes you can find that as the ink dries and settles into the paper and kind of works in the fibres of the paper, that this will sort of dry back a bit. So I ended up leaving the sky colouring and moving on to colouring the image, the rest of the image, and coming back to the sky a little bit later on once that ink had settled and I could see what I wanted to add and what I wanted to sort of do with the sky. To colour the rainbow, I simply selected one shade of each colour, keeping it quite simple, selecting colours that had a similar brightness. This is indicated by the last number, so I'm using R17 here, and it's the 7 that I was looking at when selecting markers, so that I could select markers that would blend nicely together to create the rainbow effect. Looking at these chicks sliding down the rainbow just makes me chuckle. It's so sweet, so funny, and that's my favourite thing about the Cool Chicks range of stamps from Stamping Bella. They're so humorous and quirky, and they're always up to something ridiculous, as you can see. So they're a lot of fun to work with and to colour and to create cards with. Moving on to colouring the little cloud, I used cool greys for this, and it looks a little bit dark in the video now, but as the ink settles, that will dry back a bit. And also as the scene, as I colour the rest of the scene, with all of the colour in the picture, that will appear less grey and more like it's a white cloud. I'm then going to move on to colouring the hill, which is part of the Love backdrop stamp. I coloured this way rather than colouring the chicks first, in order to minimise the likelihood that I was going to drag colour from some of the darker areas, like the pot or the sack that the chick is landing on, that I'm colouring black. So I didn't want to drag any dark pigment into the green hill with the lighter green markers. Also, if I accidentally coloured over any of the coins that are on the ground or went into the body of that chick there, I would be able to use my colourless blender and push some of that colour back out. I usually tend to colour backgrounds first, unless I'm adding a background to an image I've already coloured at an earlier stage. Either approach works just fine. It just depends on what you're colouring, what the circumstances are, and what you're comfortable with. So there is no right way to do it. I just found it easier in this instance to colour all of the background elements first and then move on to the characters. As you can see, I'm just working to sort of try and create the shape of the little hill and to add some shadows underneath those chicks, just to give the scene some depth and interest. There's nothing particularly special about it. I'm working as if there's kind of a general light source up in the top right corner, although I don't tend to stress massively about the light source. After all, there is light all around. It's not like there's just one sort of lighting up this scene from the right. There would be light bouncing around everywhere. So generally I try to colour to make things look like they've got dimension, and also just colouring to make it look appealing. We're making cards, we're not making realistic works of art. Or at least I'm not. I really just tend to bear in mind which side of the objects the main shadows are likely to be, and just keep it fairly simple, really. There's no need to get overly bogged down with that. The greens that I'm using at the moment to colour the hill are generally my go-to green combination, or one of my go-to combinations for colouring grass. I tend to gravitate towards brighter colour palettes, so this sort of yellow-green combination works really nicely, and it has a really bright, springy feel. I'm going to move on to colouring the chicks now, using one of my favourite yellow combinations, which I often also use for a sort of cartoonish blonde hair. It's not exactly a natural blonde, but it works quite nicely for some of the more whimsical or cartoonish images. If you haven't before, try using your earth tones to add shading or depth to your yellow combinations. Using the earth tones helps to desaturate the brightness of the yellows. The Copic yellow selection tends to be quite bright, and I tend to either use one of the YRs like YR24 or one of the earth tones, like here I've used E11, or you could use E35. which helps to desaturate and tone down the brightness of the yellow so that you can achieve some dimension and get some shadows in that don't look weird, and give some shape to your image, basically. You may notice when I'm adding my darkest shade when colouring something like the chicks, and you'll notice it more so when I start colouring the pot of gold in black, because that stands out a bit better. I leave a narrow border between where I put the darkest shade and the actual line of the image. This helps to create the shape, give the image some form. Overall, the chicks are pretty simple to colour. You don't have to add as much detail as I do, or you could add more detail. I don't tend to, apart from adding, as you'll see, some sort of shading, some lines on the wings to give sort of definition and sort of break that up so it's got some sort of structure. I don't tend to add a lot of texture to the chicks. They're quite small and they're quite cartoony, so I don't personally feel that they need a lot of texture. However, you could absolutely add more texture, make them look fluffy, maybe use colourless blender on a rag and add some texture that way. I have done that before with some of the larger chick images. I just don't tend to feel that chicks at this size really need it. But you could colour them more simplistically. You don't have to add the texture to the wing. You could colour it just as simply as the rest of the image. When colouring the coins, the gold coins in this, because obviously they're going to be a shade of yellow, in order to kind of separate from the chick that's landing on top of them, and yeah, to sort of make sure it doesn't just all look like a yellow blob, I used a slightly different combination of yellows, as you will see, and also introduced a stronger earth tone, E57, just underneath the chick to really sort of strengthen the shadow there and really help create some separation between those elements of the image. Having the lighter sort of edge to the chick's body, where I haven't taken the darker colour right up to the line there, and I've left that lighter sort of rim around his body, as we discussed before, that also helps because you've got that lighter area and then the shadow underneath. And this is something that really becomes even more important when you're doing no line colouring, where you don't have the strong black outline around the image. That becomes really important then to help create a separation between elements of the image and to build up the image, where the form of the image, where you don't have the lines to help you understand what you're looking at. I'm going to move on in a second to colouring the pot of gold. It could also, the way that it's been drawn, be more of a sack, as it seems to be a little bit squished over, so you could absolutely colour this in browns or whatever colour you liked. I tend to think of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so I went with making it black. I have, however, not used a black marker to achieve this. I've used, as you can see, my favourite combination of cool greys, C4, C6 and C9, and layering them up gives you a dark enough dark to make it look black. If you coloured it just with a black marker, it would look flat and it wouldn't have any shape to it. Again, you can see that I've left that lighter edge around the image, and I've left it around the top rim where the coins are. I've left a lighter edge at the bottom of that piece, and then dark shading underneath, and that really helps to give the shape to that area of the image and separate the rim of the pot from the main body. To colour the shirt on the top chick and the hats on the two bottom chicks, I opted for the same green combo, which is just one of the natural blending families, as you can see. Nothing too special here really. I did my usual, using some of the lines on, say, the hats, some of the lines that the artist has provided to see where I wanted to add maybe some creases, and yeah, just kept it fairly simple. There is absolutely no need for you to add creases and other details to the hats or any of the clothing. You can keep it as simple as you like and it will still look great. I just, as you will notice, cannot help myself. Just as I don't seem able to help myself, as you will see in some of the smaller detail areas like the buckle on the hats, I still used 3 or 4, I think 3 different markers, which is absolutely not necessary. It is a tiny area of detail, but that is just what I do. Yeah, that's just what I do. You don't have to. You can keep it much simpler than I do, especially as you'll see. I go back in later, I think, and add some glitter detail. So yeah, there is no need to be quite as crazy as me. There are certain areas where I've added less detail, like say the beer that the chick at the bottom is holding. You'll see in a minute that I kept it quite simple when colouring that. Mostly because it's just really not a huge area and it's not the main focus of the image. And I think it's important to bear in mind where your focus is going to be, particularly in a scene like this. You could go to town and colour everything with the tiniest detail, or you can let some things kind of go. Say I could have added much more texture to the grass. I could have done more with the sky. In fact, I did sort of think I could have maybe masked and stamped a couple more clouds. But then at the end, when I've added the sentiment to the card, it kind of fills in that space anyway. And you kind of risk going a bit overboard. So with things, you know, pick the things that matter to you most. What do you want people to be looking at in your scene? Really, it's the chicks. I guess what I'm trying to say is don't make work for yourself where you don't need to. Certainly I do in some elements of this scene. As you'll see in a minute, I will probably do a little bit more with the hearts on the love backdrop stamp area than I really needed to. I didn't need to use 2 different shades of red on these, especially since at the end I add glitter pen and white jelly roll pen detail to them. There's absolutely no need for me to use two colours, but it made me happy, so you know, that's what I did. So basically just do what makes you happy. Don't stress over every tiny detail. It's really not necessary. If the glass of beer was a larger image, it was a larger part of an image, it was the focal point, then, you know, yeah, really go to town, do some realistic shading, try and get that to look as good as possible. In this, it's a cartoony scene, and, you know, it's good enough. So, yeah. I don't think I've mentioned so far, but I stamped and I'm colouring this scene on Make It Colour blending card, which is my favourite. It's my go-to paper for colouring with Copic markers. It holds a lot of ink, and that's pretty important. As you can see, I tend to layer quite a lot of ink on the paper. You don't have to have this paper. I sell it on my blog, markergeek.com. If you're in the I'm in the UK, so that's great if you're in the UK or Europe. If you're in the US, Canada or elsewhere, there is probably a paper that is fairly similar available in your location. Express It blending card is really good also. I prefer the Make It Colour blending card personally, and it's more easily available to me, obviously. But Express It will work well. And paper tends to be, like most things, fairly personal. It depends on how you like to work, what your preferences are. So my recommendation would be to test any papers for yourself and see how you get on with them. As far as ink goes, I tend to use my favourite things. I think it's Extreme Black hybrid ink. I used to use Memento Tuxedo Black ink, which is a good ink for using with Copics and other alcohol-based markers. However, I prefer the boldness of the black of some of the newer hybrid inks. They tend to give a nicer, crisper black line, which I prefer. I don't think I've got too much more to say about the process at this point. I'm just colouring away happily. You will have to let me know how you have enjoyed the video with the voiceover as opposed to my usual sort of speed colouring video with just music over the top. If you've enjoyed hearing me waffle about colouring, let me know. Hopefully, if I do more of these, I will be less awkward at some point as I get used to talking. I don't normally actually talk this much and for so long. If you have enjoyed listening to me chatting about the colouring process, please do let me know if there are any topics that you would particularly like me to talk about, any mediums that you'd like to watch me try out and maybe talk about the process. Really, I want to make these videos as useful for you as possible. And as you can see, now I'm doing my thing, colouring those hearts, and yeah, I could have left it with the R17, that would have been perfectly fine, especially bearing in mind that I use the glitter pens later on, which gives some texture to it and, you know, some sort of depth in their own right. However, no, I can't leave it, so I have to fuss with the tiny details. So I come in with R46, I think it is, and then blend that out again with the R17. So yeah, this video could have been slightly shorter if I'd just left well alone and left it at the R17, but there you go, that's just what I do. And once I'm done with the hearts, you will see that I decided to fuss a little bit more with the shadows underneath the chick and the pot of gold, just to strengthen those up a little bit. Not really sure I needed to, but again, as I've said, I can't stop myself from fussing with it. I can't just walk away and leave it alone. There's always, you know, just one little adjustment or one little tweak. So don't feel like you have to go that far. You know, if you're happy with how it looks, then great, leave it as it is. But equally, don't be scared to go a little bit darker, to add some deeper shadows, because it can create so much interest and depth in the image. So if it's not something you're comfortable with, then try stepping out of your comfort zone, try adding some deeper shading, some deeper shadows, and see how much life it brings to your images and to your scenes. And yeah, it's just ink and paper at the end of the day. So if you end up messing it up, you know, no huge loss. If it works, then fantastic, you've just leveled up. Now I've moved on to one of my favourite things to do. I was inspired to do this by an artist I follow on Instagram, Max Steven. I'll pop a link to him in the description below. He adds glitter detail, sparkle to his artwork using the speaker glitter pens and a white gel pen, and it looks absolutely amazing. I don't do the technique as much justice as he does, especially since these are smaller areas, but it gives a more interesting effect, I find, than just using, say, just a glitter pen, like the glitter brush pens, to just add a layer of sparkle over the top. There's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes it's fun to have this added bit of texture that using this dotting technique with the glitter pens and adding some like white highlight areas with the white gel pen, it just really gives it a little extra something and makes it look really interesting. It does take a little bit more time and patience than just using a glitter brush pen or some glitter paint, but I think it's worth it, especially on an image like this, where just using it in a few areas kind of really adds just that little bit of something extra that catches the eye. One important tip, which I don't always follow myself, so do as I say, not as I do. Pick an area to start with. If you're right-handed, probably start in the top left corner and work from that area across, to avoid smudging your work, because it's going to stay wet for a little while. So yeah, that will avoid smudging your glitter and getting it all over different areas of your image. As I say, I don't always tend to do that, but I do tend to be fairly careful that I'm not sort of lying my hand on the image. And I think that's really all that I've got to say that's of any use. So if you've enjoyed this video, like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel to keep up with what's coming next. You can visit me over on my blog, markergeek.com, and you can also find me regularly on the Stamping Bella blog, as you may be aware. Yeah, thank you for joining me today, especially if you've made it this far. Well done. I know it's been a longer video. You will find links for all the products and people I've referred to in the description below. I'll catch you on the next video, and in the meantime, happy colouring!